We now turn to a uh, uh, discussion by your county council on the Clark County Legacy Lands Program. So staff, if you would begin, we look forward to this discussion and hearing what you have to say. So please proceed.
Good morning. For the record, Rocky Houston. I'm the division manager for the Parks and Lands division here in Public Works. I'm going to turn it over to my esteemed colleagues, Kevin Tyler, the section manager for our land section, and Danielle Colley, who is our program manager for the program. Kevin.
Good morning, Council. I think this is a really good segue of the conversation that you just had about healthy communities. The Legacy Lands Program provides open space, timberlands, and farmlands that are critical to our community. Next slide, please. Our goal today will be to give you an overview of Conservation Futures funding and the Legacy Lands Program, including its history and budget. We'll provide a summary of the Natural Areas Acquisition Plan and proposed updates to the Legacy Lands Guidance Manual, including the role of the Parks Advisory Board. This framework will help guide acquisitions over the coming years. We'll also provide you with a look at the 6-year forecast for Conservation Futures funding and the 6-year project list that is incorporated into the Parks Capital Improvement Plan. We'll discuss some next steps beyond that at the end. The Conservation Futures Program was adopted by the county in 1985 and later renamed the Legacy Lands Program in 2006. The program is funded through a property tax levy of up to 6.25 cents per $1,000 of assessed value that is applied to property countywide for the purchase of open space, farm, and agricultural lands and timberlands as defined in state law. To date, the program has acquired approximately 5,400 acres, and acquisitions have been made inside most cities in the county and throughout the unincorporated area, including many well-known parks and natural areas. Next slide, please. Here's a list of some of the more significant acquisitions using Conservation Futures funding. The most recent additions were the Gordy Jolma Family Natural Area, formerly known as the Cedars Golf Course. In addition to Green Mountain made by the city of Camas, and the Hantwick to Molten Falls Trail reconveyance from the Department of Natural Resources. Next slide, please. After adoption of the program in the late 1980s, the county established an Open Space Commission. The commission authored the 1992 Clark County Open Space Commission Report, which has served as a guiding document for preservation of open space in Clark County. Since that time, the county adopted the 2004 Conservation Areas Acquisition Plan, performed an update to that plan in 2014, and recently completed the 2022 to 2027 Natural Areas Acquisition Plan. Since moving the program to Parks and Lands, efforts have been made to more formally recognize the connection between the comprehensive plan, the Parks, Recreation, and Open Space Plan, and Legacy Lands in meeting the county's goals and objectives surrounding parks, open space, and natural areas. And that's why the plan was renamed to the Natural Areas Acquisition Plan. Next slide, please. The Natural Areas Acquisition Plan is structured to maintain compliance with Recreation and Conservation Office required plan elements, including conservation goals and objectives, and inventory of the county's resources, the public involvement process, a demand or needs analysis, and a 6-year capital plan. And that's achieved through the county's 6-year Parks Capital Improvement Plan. And these are all required elements that help us maintain grant eligibility. Next slide, please. To guide acquisition, the county is divided up into 19 watershed-based sub-areas, as seen here. Each sub-area possesses significant conservation values for public use, habitat protection, clean water, and other purposes. This approach provides flexibility across the county for all who are eligible to receive funding. Within each sub-area, high-value conservation lands are mapped using streams, floodplains, riparian habitat, wetlands, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife priority habitats, previously mapped high-value conservation areas from 2004, undeveloped and developed parcels meeting certain criteria, public lands intersecting the network, and fringe habitats such as forested hillsides. Next slide, please. This graphic shows the approximate split of Conservation Futures funding based on the approved 2023 baseline budget. Historically, the county has bonded for project acquisition. Current debt service includes only the recent bond from 2018, which is about $534,000 annually. The current fund balance is a little over $10 million. Maintenance and operations is limited to 25% of the prior year levy amount, and that includes administration of the program. And the revenue collected annually is currently between 2.8 and 2.9 million. And the current levy rate is actually down at around 2.7 cents per thousand of assessed value. Next slide. This 6-year forecast shows the estimated project delivery for all of the proposed projects included in the 2024 to 2029 Parks Capital Improvement Plan. The forecast incorporates ongoing work and assumptions of for a fund balance policy, which is in a draft status. The initial version of the draft fund balance policy is conservative in nature and can potentially allow for more available fund balance and ongoing budget for capital acquisitions down the road. There'll be more work on that. Project lists are updated annually and will incorporate future sponsor projects as approved by council. Expenditures shown here in the forecast include operations and maintenance costs and debt service. And maintenance and operations expenditures, including administration, are capped at 25% of the prior year levy, and that's about $700,000 annually. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Danielle to talk about the work that she's been doing on the Legacy Lands Guidance Manual.
Okay. So Danielle Cowley, Legacy Lands was incorporated into Public Works Parks in 2017. The guidance manual provided structure to the program, has not been updated since 2013. Following the adoption of the 2022 to 27 Natural Areas Acquisition Plan, staff began working on update to the guidance manual. County Code 3.24.040 identifies an evaluation and selection committee for evaluating eligible proposals and recommending acquisition programs for consideration. Public Works proposes the Parks Advisory Board for this site selection committee. The guidance manual expands upon the watershed-based sub-area approach to acquisitions and outlines the process more clearly for soliciting project proposals for eligible sponsors. In addition, the manual the manual further defines procedures for handling conversion of conservation project areas involving lands used inconsistent with the program. And lastly, the manual will incorporate property management guidelines when completed. Next slide. This matrix outlines the pathway proposed for projects, how they will follow. County-sponsored projects will be analyzed against the acquisition plan and criteria, evaluation by staff, and presented to the Parks Advisory Board and Council at the point a purchase and sale agreement has been negotiated with landowners. County-sponsored projects are identified generically by sub-area in the capital plan. Sponsored agencies will be notified twice during the 6-year plan horizon requesting project proposals. The county will receive project proposals, reviews those internally with the Parks Advisory Board, subcommittee, then present a ranked list to the Parks Advisory Board and Council, and they will finalize the list. At that point, it will be incorporated into the 6-year capital plan. Next slide. So this kind of gives you an idea of our timelines of how we're going to proceed with the actual sponsorship projects. So twice during the plan horizon, county staff will solicit projects for sponsoring agencies near the beginning of the year. Sponsor agencies will have 2 months to submit a proposal. Staff will review the proposals for consistency with plans and the guidance manual and schedule site visits. Staff and PAB, Parks Advisory Board Subcommittee, will evaluate and rank projects and then present them back to the Parks Advisory Board. Parks Advisory Board will then make recommendations to Council, and then staff will request a work session. Following guidance from Council, staff will incorporate the projects into the 6-year capital plan. After the adoption of the 6-year Parks capital plan, staff and sponsors will negotiate an interagency agreement and with the sponsors, and they will have 2 years to complete this project. The interagency agreement may be extended through Council's approval. This slide shows the proposed 6-year project list that is incorporated in a 6-year capital improvement plan. The completed 6-year CIP capital plan will be presented to Council in a work session on October 11th. You can see the funding available during the later years substantially drops off, and this is partially due to the amount of funding allocated in the draft fund balance policy we just discussed. So this may change depending on how the policy is finalized. Moving forward, Parks and Lands will work towards finalizing the guidance manual following Council and Parks Advisory Board's input. Meanwhile, the guidance manual has been advertised for a 30-day comment period and is available on the county website, and it's open until October 18th. Staff plans to bring the guidance manual back to the Council for adoption later this year or early next year. We've already begun discussing and outreaching with all the sponsors, agencies that qualify, and hoping to get all their feedback in the coming month with the goal of soliciting for projects in 2024. I want to take the opportunity to thank you for your time, and we're here to answer any questions you have.
I have one question. It was back on slides 9 and 10 primarily. There is a huge section of that monetary pie chart, thank you, that is devoted there to capital acquisitions. Would you describe what is happening in that section of the pie and what will happen in the near future? How will it be adjusted relative to the other things that go on, such as maintenance, acquisition, planning, et cetera?
If I may, Councilor, initially, we are required per RCWs to dedicate 75% of the funds to acquisition activities. Only 25% of the funds can be utilized for operation and maintenance and administrative costs. So that number will, if numbers decrease, then we continue to have to look at the prior year's money that came in to adjust that. To the specificity of what we're looking to do, I'll turn it over to Kevin.
I think to specify, that number will change each year depending on the 6-year capital plan. So if we looked at the forecast or that 6-year list, it shows a list of projects each year. And depending on the timing of those projects, we will be working to acquire property in a given year. So what we have budgeted for this year is $2.25 million. What we have budgeted for next year, I'd have to look at the forecast, but it's a different number and it's going to change as we go through time. We get out to the end of the 6-year forecast and it's about $1.5 million annually that we'll have available for acquisition.
The 75% figure that you gave is really interesting. Where does that come from?
Counselor, that comes from the RCWs And I believe it's reflected in county code as well, sir?
I believe it is, it's just in the RCW, the county code refers to the RCW about how we administer the program. So we're limited to using 25% of the prior year levy for maintenance of county properties that are acquired. The remaining 75% is for acquisitions. And as we mentioned earlier, that we do have a healthy fund balance right now. And so the reason that there's more than 75% programmed on an annual basis until we get later in the forecast is that we have that fund balance available to us right now.
Thank you.
And if I may, to follow up to that, is that's why there are sponsors that are available to utilize these funds, kind of like a grant program to where other land managers or NGOs can acquire. So therefore, utilizing these funds to not increase our management requirements, but again, provide that asset in perpetuity to be protected for that open space.
And just to add to what Rocky said, the conservation futures funding is intended to be, I mean, it's collected countywide, so it's intended to be spread out countywide. And it's other entities that are available to use it include not just the county, the cities, towns, metropolitan park districts, nonprofit historic preservation corporations, and also nonprofit nature conservancy corporations. So there's a way to spread out the funding across many partners. And that's what the sponsorship outline that Danielle provided is about.
Madam Chair.
Yes, Councilor.
So first of all, this isn't the briefing I thought we were going to have today, but I appreciate it. And it was a good overview, again, of the entirety of the program. And you've touched on some of the points I wanted to highlight and ask questions about. And certainly this pie chart is kind of the central bullseye of all these discussions and what role the county council may have in directing this. I mean, there's a lot of detail in this. Everything has to be sustainable, so I don't disagree with the split that the RCW may lay out there for us. But just, you know, years ago at a park advisory meeting, I saw the list of proposed conservation efforts and for legacy lands, and then later we had a work session on it, and in the meantime, the Cedars issue popped up, and I tried to, it was in my district, so I elevated it, and I saw that as a big success, that we were able to get that project completed. So it was an example of the process, but when you put it in the structure of the 6-year capital plan, here are my questions, because I'd like to accelerate this. Mm-hmm. Number one, I want to accelerate this, which gets to the issue of the fund balance strategy. You know, we have over $10 million, and I've seen that amount sitting there, and you have a budget of just over $3.5 million. That's a disconnect, because the county is not in the business of just collecting taxes and building a fund balance, which we did see in the mental health sales tax. Same issue there, because the process was suspended and we weren't spending the money like we should over a number of years during the pandemic. And for the rest of the council, I mean, I keep harping on this, and I'm hoping to get this infused into this budget, is some kind of conservation overlay, a conservation easement of farmland for those farmers that want to do it. What will that cost? What do we project it would cost? I don't know what an easement costs. You know, when someone wants in perpetuity to have their farmland remain open space as a farmland, what does that cost the county potentially? Because I want to do that now. You know, I brought that up in December over Heritage Farm, which shouldn't cost us anything because we own it, other than the paperwork to get it in the land documents. You know, so I'm hoping we can infuse and energize this process, because we literally have about $7 million we could be spending right now and still have a good fund balance to maintain the operations and maintenance. So I'm hoping that my fellow counselors will join in trying to give some new and different direction and infuse, and that's what I thought this presentation was going to be focused on. What are the projects you're looking at right now for conservation? Where are they in the priority list? How much are they? Where are we in the process? Do we need to prioritize it more? You know, the last time I'd seen it, we had a lot of several projects within the city of Vancouver, along the waterfront, Columbia River waterfront. You know, can we get that teed up? Can we make some decisions? Does the council want to weigh in on that? But I would like to get some kind of conservation effort right now, structured, in place, budgeted, so that we can, for whatever farms are out there that want to remain farms, let's help them do that. Anyway, that's, I think I've kind of hit all the main points, but the budget, the fund balance, and the process for getting this stuff moving forward so we can expend this, what I would consider surplus right now. Obviously, we don't want to dip below whatever fund balance we need to have to ensure some safe passage through some bad tax years. In any case, any comments on where can we go next? What are we going to get briefed on the conservation effort for farms specifically?
Yeah, I think we can address all of those questions and concerns, Counselor. And these are things that we've heard from you recently, and I think what we've been trying to do with the program is make that transition. The former method of Conservation Futures program was to bond against, so we would do a call for projects, we would get this huge list of projects, we would issue a bond, and we weren't very nimble. And so this approach that we've been discussing with you today is to try to become more nimble. So we haven't had another call for projects since that one in 2017, 2018. So we have a list of projects here that are sort of legacy that we're continuing to work on. And at the same time, we're trying to update the program so it is more nimble. And that's why we've been focusing on this sub-area approach. So you see that we have in the out years, we have, you know, we don't have a specific property listed. We have generic sub-areas listed, which is how we were able to leverage the funding and go after Gordy Joma Family Natural Area, because we had a project identified in that sub-area. So when something comes up in a sub-area, we can jump at it more and then make the capital plan adjustment with you at the time. So I think that's how we're trying to be more nimble. We're also engaging our partners, Real Property Services, survey, making sure that we get out ahead of properties and get that engagement with the landowner, since it is a willing seller, willing buyer program. So that's the kind of nimble side of things. To give you an update on farm preservation, so we have a project that was identified several years ago, and for various reasons didn't really get off the ground, but we've got it off the ground now. We're working with the Washington Farmland Trust to do a first farm preservation easement. They're working with the landowner right now. I think we can probably provide you with information about that in the near future once they are sort of working their way through that negotiation process. But that's a project that we expect to close next year. And so that would be the first, and that would be a good sort of baseline of what it takes to get a conservation easement in place for farmland. And we have another one established in 2025 that we can start working right on the heels of that one. We've incorporated another project later on in the 6-year program to do, again, the same kind of thing.
So what I'm hearing is we're looking at an overarching program, but you have a specific property you're working on right now. And then it brings to mind something I hadn't really thought about. You know, anytime we're dealing with property, then it goes into this executive cloak of secrecy. And so I see a friction point there of how do you lay this out? How do you let other farmers know that this program may be available before it gets into this executive cloak of secrecy in negotiating
Right.
land prices. I'm not sure what the
And
solution is.
if I may, I think our intent was to learn from the Farm Trust, learn what connections they have, how they go about that to where we can replicate that or expand that partnership. They have relationships that we don't and get that word out. And it's always important, of course, to have that first success that then leads to others to be interested in it. What I've seen other places, and I don't know what our appraisals will come out at, is usually you're buying the development rights away from these properties, essentially with that conservation easement, and that's 50 to 75% of the appraised value. So they can be fairly expensive. If someone wants to give them to us, we're willing to work with you on that. But if we are trying to do that cost, and so I think that's sort of the basic number. And we'll need to follow up with the Farm Trust and see if that, what I just said, is consistent with what they've been doing here in Washington. So we're trying to be flexible in making sure that we have a lot of areas identified to allow us to respond to a potential acquisition. We've had a few acquisitions that we thought were going to be great that we just didn't get to a negotiation level to order an appraisal. So we were trying to do that to provide that flexibility. Once we sort of have something that looks like it's got some legs, that's where we work with looking at our limitation in regards to our capital budget for that year, as well, because it's in our 6-year capital plan, allows us that flexibility to come to you and ask for that budget adjustment associated, because it's already identified in our capital plan.
Thanks for all that. And I didn't realize it was that costly, 75%. I don't know what other counties do. So my zeal to get this done and get this working is tempered by this comment, because I saw it as a taxpayer citizen in another county where that had a lot of vineyards, really wealthy landowners, covering hundreds, if not thousands, of acres of vineyards. And then we saw all the conservation money going to them for them to promise that they'll keep it as vineyards. And I thought that, wow, that's really unjust enrichment here. You know, they have no intent ever of developing this property other than for the vineyard that it already is, and how it was doing extraordinarily well financially. So, I mean, that I tempers the zeal with, you know, we have to be careful on how we spend our precious conservation money, so we don't just, you know, throw money at investments that really won't pay. And the other part of that is none of this land was ever made available to the public, other than you could drive by it and see it. I mean, you didn't have trails through it, you didn't have open access, because it was still private operating vineyard, which I saw as, wow, public money, and we get to look at it. Yeah, there's some benefit to that, but anyway, just some additional thoughts to tuck away.
In regards to our fund balance, if you did look at the slide where we are trying to trickle it down and get it down, and so over the next 6-year period, we're getting it down to around that $3 to $4 million if the acquisitions come forward and we're able to execute on those. So again, we're very aware, keenly aware of a big balance and trying to, again, have this nimbleness, you know, and I think Danielle's been doing a good job of engaging and getting some of those leads to come in and trying to rewrite that narrative of how long we take and how slow we are. We still are slow, but we want to be 6 months, 9 months slow instead of years slow. And so I think that's, again, where we've lost some transactions because of that prior experience. And so that's all feedback we're learning every time we have a transaction that goes sideways. They choose a different offer instead of trying to work through our process. Again, trying to understand, where did we miss out? Where did we step wrong so that we can become better at that next opportunity?
Thank you.
Other questions or comments from council? Councilor Young.
Yes, thank you. First of all, I want to thank my colleagues and staff in advance because I have a few questions here. First thing was, I'm curious about the financial structure with the levy. So is I mean, this is a special fund defined in RCW, so is it subject to the 1% cap, okay, that we're used to? And when we initially rolled it out, did we roll it out at the maximum 6.25 cents per thousand? So it's maxed out per RCW then?
It was at its rollout. Now it's currently around
2.7.
2.7, so it's less than half of what the max is.
So does that mean that it could be increased to up to 6.25 cents?
We'd have to go through that levy lift process.
Right, okay. All right. So then, and this kind of goes along the same lines, some of the questions that Councilor Medvedji was asking, but I'm kind of wanting to understand the overarching focus, like, you know, how this is steered, you know, how, and I appreciate a lot of the, actually in the slides, you answered a lot of my questions. It's clear that we're trying to be equitable and, you know, hitting every portion of the county so that they're not funding and not receiving. But how are these plans being chosen? How are they being asked for? And then is there a, I mean, was there like a steering committee with that? I can't remember if you had mentioned that.
So the guiding document for the program is the Natural Areas Acquisition Plan. And so it lays out the goals and objectives, which tie closely to the Parks, Recreation, Open Space Plan, which ties closely to the county's comprehensive plan. So it helps us meet those elements of the comp plan that are related to open space, recreation, things of that nature. So that's sort of the umbrella, right? And then within each of those watershed sub-areas, the defining area is high-value conservation, right? And that's either open space or farmland or timberland. Those are sort of the three categories. And open space is a large category, which includes all kinds of things like fish and wildlife habitat and stream corridors and things of that nature. So that identifies the priorities. And then, as I mentioned, we, in the past, used to put out a call for projects. And so entities, including the county and the cities and the Columbia Land Trust, would come forward with project ideas. And so each of those agencies had their sort of own priorities. And the county had visions of like an East Fork Lewis River Greenway or a Salmon Creek Greenway, right? And so we would be proposing projects along those different corridors at the time. So what we've sort of moved to is having a dual process where those agencies and entities can come together with their projects that they prioritize in their communities, which helps us to distribute the money throughout the community. And then the county will have its own projects, which will sort of fall in line with what the council and what the council determines are the priorities in the plan. Like, is farm conservation going to be a priority? Are we going to continue with the East Fork Lewis River Greenway, things of that nature? So that's essentially how it's been working and how we're trying to transition.
Okay, and then what about policy in terms of debt? You know, issuance of debt, paying off the debt?
Yeah, so again, in the past was the bonding approach, and the last bond, after that occurred, you know, there were changes in policy on the way that we were going to do that, and so we haven't been pursuing bonding moving forward.
How did that process unfold? Is that like a staff level decision? Did that come to the council? Or?
It comes to the council, and the treasurer's office was very involved in getting that bond out.
So in the past, we would go through that process to create a list, and then we would bring that forward and go through the internal review for potential to bond it, and then come to council for that recommendation, and then go through that process. And I think what we found, at least in the last bond, is that most of the properties we'd identified, we didn't buy for a variety of reasons. We're a willing buying, willing seller program, and so people decided not to sell to us. They sold to someone else. So we were then going around and looking at other properties, much like the Cedars Golf Courses, where we'd lost some other transactions, and so we within that focus, that sub area, to meet those achievements. And it took us a long time. I think that was 3 or 4 years to finally spend through this money, and I think that was a concern, is that bonds were viewed as more of an emergency request, and so it's hard for us with our willing buying, willing seller to lock people in before we go out through the bonding process and have money there. And so that's where we're trying to limit it to those smaller acquisition sizes at this time until it's an opportunity again to consider a bond. But right now we're trying to spend down the money we do have in the bank and look at those as they come through. And I think they come through a couple of different ways. We're always looking at what's going on out there for real estate. Leads come in all the time. People ask us, or we hear about a property, as well as we are identifying individual parcels and trying to go out there and cold call them as well. Would you be interested? Would you be willing to do a first right of refusal? All of those sort of things to continue to create that connection, to increase that value for whether it's the East Fork Lewis River, which is a great example of how we've continued to do that. And we start to climb a mountain on an acquisition, and we get almost there, and then we tumble down and we start over. And we've got an acquisition like that right now, where I think we've been after it 3 or 4 times, and we can just never put it together. And hopefully this last time we will. And so that's the frustrating and exciting part of our side of trying to put it together, and continue to look at forest lands, looking at these other ways to continue to take that concept of preservation and those open spaces to keep that character, as well as improve that habitat that we do have here. And so it's a joy and a pain.
So first of all, I have the utmost respect for you ever landing any transaction that fulfills, because it seems like at every step of the way you're at a disadvantage, given the restraints that you have, the fact that it's government, how it's funded. I mean, every step of the way it's tough. So thank you for that information. It's very helpful. Actually, I mean, you answered a lot of my questions in what you said and in your presentation, but my last question was, and I'm starting to understand a little bit already off the bat, but in the budget, there's $291,000 for acquisition planning. Can you kind of explain that a little bit?
Yeah, the acquisition planning component is working on the natural areas acquisition plan and the guidance manual so that we have that program established. It's working with the other entities so that when they're ready to bring forward a project and we're going to present it to the Parks Advisory Board and then bring it to council, it's all staff time directed at those types of things. And that's mostly the 3 of us right here that you're seeing. And it's also putting it out there to like real estate services to help us with appraisals and things of that nature. So, yeah.
And the last question, which I'll just, I mean, if we could schedule an offline meeting at some point, I would love to learn a little bit more about farm conservation easements. It'd take time that we don't need to spend with everybody here, but I would appreciate getting a little bit better of a background on that.
Yeah, we can do that.
Cool. Thank you.
I'll ask, if I can, ask council, since Councilor Meviji also brought up the conservation easements with regards to farming, is that something council actually wants to have a discussion at council time about, so everybody's hearing the same information?
Yes, I
That
think
would be
that would
great.
be far superior to offline. When we all know the same information about a topic that's of importance, I think that's the way to go.
I'll add it to a future council time meeting. Thank you.
Chair,
Yes, go ahead.
I have a few questions swirling around, just related to a work session on the conservation easements for farmland. I would suggest we invite the Washington Farmland Trust to join in that presentation. I think that's the organization that we're working with on this. And just for starters, looking at the money that's available, the 6.25 cents that we started out with now is down to 2.7. And while we do have a healthy fund balance that we can be spending down ultimately, and with the price of land, we're not able to really invest in as much as we were when this program began. So I'm concerned about that, what our dollars are able to get at this point. And I appreciate the trying to develop more flexibility within the program, because I know I've had several people approach me. There's a piece of property for sale on the East Fork or somewhere. There's an opportunity, some that comes up. So I think the sub-area approach, where you can then look for opportunities within a geographic area, is a good way to go. And that, I know we were talking about climate change, maybe that was just yesterday, but there are opportunities to leverage dollars, carbon offsets, and various programs, new programs that will be coming down the line. And I think with the Ridgefield pits was an example of how we could apply a certain amount of money toward a much larger project. So I think we can get a lot more for our money when we're able to leverage dollars. Could you talk a little bit about how you use the money to leverage larger projects?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of ways that we've been trying to leverage funding. And so one is the standard approach of, we have a property in mind, we're going to apply for a grant to the state and seek acquisition funding to help support that acquisition. Another approach that's been very successful is the design and acquisition, or acquisition and development type grants. So a good example of that was the Lower Daybreak Trail. We acquired the property and pursued an acquisition and development grant. So the funding that went from the county towards acquisition was the match, and then they gave us money to design and develop the trail on the property. That was the State Recreation and Conservation Office. We've been really successful working with various agencies and entities like the Lower Columbia Estuary Partnership, Clark Public Utilities, Watershed Alliance, et cetera, that we have property, they have goals and objectives of restoring, fish and wildlife habitat, stream corridors and things like that. And so the two together, we can make a nice agreement where they do work on the county property. So we've got a lot of those types of things going on out there in the community.
Great, because it seems to me that with this money that we have to spend, we could, I don't know, I think at least double it with the various organizations that can help with the restoration or provide additional funding. I was wondering about the sponsoring agencies that you work with that are maybe submitting proposals. Do you have a list of those sponsoring agencies? Because I'm just wondering if someone has, just an individual, knows of a potential good project, how could that get into the mix in terms of deciding what to purchase?
We do have a list of those entities that have traditionally been sponsors. It's in the guidance manual. Danielle's going to remind me what page. But it's been the cities in our area and the Columbia Land Trust. We haven't had a lot of other sponsor applications over the years. We do want to take a closer look at the way that the RCW defines sponsor agencies, and then work with our legal team to determine who are the eligible entities. Danielle's been doing a really good job of outreaching with all of the different community groups, just to get the word out about Legacy Lands and what the program is and how we can help, that kind of thing. But
Great.
Traditionally, it's been the cities and Land Trust.
Good. And because I represent District 5, I have to ask about the equine community, and if you seek out their input on if the The equine community, I mean, there's 35,000 horses in Clark County, and I know I've heard from that community that there's shrinking number of places that they can actually go with their horses. Could you speak to that?
We've worked with the Executive Horse Council in the past, and a good example of that is the Lower Daybreak property. I know they were very involved in the sort of work on a master plan that I don't know what level of or what stage it was finalized or not finalized, but they were very involved in that property in the years past. And I think also at Whipple Creek, they tend to be more involved in our parks properties, the big regional parks, but
Okay.
it's definitely an agency that, or an entity that we can do some outreach to.
I know, I think they're very interested, and as development has occurred in some areas, I think around 179th, some of the barns and stables we have been lost, so I think there's concern about that. So I just raised that for that constituency. And to the agricultural conservation easements, I know that was set up, wow, I think that was set up, the council in 2017 identified that as a priority. And it seemed that it was just really a one-off, that your department really hadn't worked in that arena before. So I think it would be worthwhile to really look at building out that program, if it is to be a component of legacy lands, so that, and I think if we establish an agricultural commission, could have input on what are we actually trying to achieve, rather than, similar to your sub-area planning, look for areas that would have the most potential for long-term agricultural land protection. And so I think some planning resources going into really figuring out what it is that we're trying to achieve, and working with the agricultural community to help develop that. Because I think there are a number of property owners who, they care about their land. They've been working it for, decades, generations, and, some, I believe, would be interested in donating an easement, because, they still keep ownership of the property. There's restrictions that go along with that, but it would secure agricultural land in perpetuity. So I'm all supportive of really figuring that out and identifying areas where there's that active agriculture that still exists in the prime soils. Let's see if I have any more questions.
Councilor Marshall, if I may, the follow-up to the equine question you had is that a great example of where we did work with Legacy Land Program to help preserve a connection is between Whipple Creek and the fairgrounds. So that property that used to have a stable, we had a gate agreement, which allowed them to access our property, but didn't allow us to really access theirs. So it should be coming, I think it was on the agenda, but I think it's bumped out a week or two for an acquisition of real property, preserve that connection through the new development, to where that connection for all user groups, equine, bicycle, and pedestrian, will be able to have that connection at a safe crossing of 10th Street and continue to preserve that. I just want to make a note is that we've not closed any access or any use of equine that I'm aware of. So we are continuing to try to maintain and preserve those opportunities we do have on our property. And we do have a meeting getting set up with stakeholders within the equine community to revisit our capital plan and identify those projects and create a forum or a mechanism to where we have communication to identify projects on our property. And I assume through that process, maybe we get a conduit of those opportunities for acquisitions and other things. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that. I recall seeing that trail I think, a dotted line for that trail. So thanks for bringing that up and working with that community. So it's a wonderful program. I support it enthusiastically, and thanks for your work on this.
Chair, if I can just ask a quick clarifying question to Council Marshall.
Please.
I think in your question and your hope is that you would like to have the Washington Farm Trust attend the council time discussion on the conservation easements on farmland. One, is that accurate? Okay.
It
So
is
the
accurate.
other question, thank you. So the other question I have is the council supportive of that? So I just want to make sure that we're following the right protocol and have a clear direction.
I'm very supportive. I mean, I'd almost like to be given some time to weigh in, or at least be available for questions, you know, basically to participate in the session.
We
I
can reach
would
out
be
to
supportive
the
of their
Farmland
presence
Trust.
for sure.
Thank you. And just a clarifying note, the Washington Farmland Trust will play a similar role that the Columbia Land Trust plays in working collaboratively with the Legacy Lands program. That's all from me.
Kathleen, does that answer your question?
Yes, I think everybody was supportive of it. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Is there anything else from council on the Legacy Lands program? Well, thank you very much for your presentation. And we always look forward to hearing more about the plans and the focus on acquisition and where that is going. So thank you very much. It is 10:25. I'm going to ask council if you would like to take a 10-minute break. This is not a lunch break, but just a quick break.
I would appreciate a quick break.
Great. How about 10:35? And see you back.